To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. That quote was by Marcus Tullius Cicero, the ancient Roman statesman, lawyer, scholar, and writer. Cicero urged us over 2,000 years ago to look back at history to better understand the path forward. In this early November, we are at the Yanqi Lake Convention and Exhibition Center near Beijing to celebrate the inaugural World Conference of Classics. Esteemed scholars and experts in classical civilization gather here to trace the origins of human thought and extract wisdom from human history. In this forum, we will focus on the modern significance of classical studies. Why do we need to study classics today? How can classical knowledge help solve contemporary global issues, and how can the East and West learn from each other's classical traditions? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. This edition is jointly brought to you by the Institute of Foreign Literature at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and CGTN. And I have together with me 5 distinguished guests here to discuss these important questions with me, starting from my immediate left, Chen Wei, Director of the Institute of Foreign Literature at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, or CAS, and he's also a member of CAS. Theodoros Papangelis, member of the Academy of Athens, section of Letters and Fine Arts in Greece. Valery Petrov, Chief Research Fellow and Director of the Center for Ancient and Medieval Philosophy and Science at the Institute of Philosophy of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Tim Whitmarsh, Regius Professor of Greek at the Department of Classics of the University of Cambridge, also a Fellow of the British Academy in the UK. And last but not least, Giorgio Inglese, Professor of Italian Literature at the Department of Literature and Modern Cultures and Faculty of Arts and Humanities at Sapienza University of Rome, Italy. Gentlemen, the warmest welcome to The Point. Let's get straight down to business, and one of our central points today is, of course, classical studies. But before we dive into the details, exactly how do you define classics and classical studies? If you're not very much interested in these maybe obscure discussions, I've asked my guests to use simple languages, to use concrete examples, and refer to our current affairs and daily lives of everybody nowadays. So don't worry, let's try. Professor Cheng.
Thank you, Liu Xin. I'm greatly honored and a little intimidated to be here with these 4 gorgeous classicists. I'm not my classicist myself. My specialism is English literature in the age of Victoria, which Tim Marsh will know much about it. The Victorian age saw the rise and fall of the classical studies in England. Yeah, to some extent, the world today is like the Victorian world. It is best age as well as the worst age, according to Dickens. Yeah, we see in this age the rapid industrialization and commercialization, numerous steamships and railways and gunboats, and the rising tides of the utilitarianism. But we see also in this age the poverty, the war, and everything that was has vanished. And people have the tragic feeling of being alienated from the whole of the humanity. So the classes rose and to fight back the utilitarianism, as some very famous people like Henry Newman and Matthew Arnold and the Oxford followers, the fight back the utilitarianism and reaffirmed the dignity of human beings, the meaning of life, the value to be, the human being, more human being, and the significance to be good. Yeah. But in Matthew Arnold's words, the classical research, classical studies, it's exclusively the study of the ancient Greek and Rome civilization. I wonder if Matthew Arnold was influenced by Hegel's philosophy of world history. Hegel argued that the great event of the human beings, or in another word, the great event of world historical significance take place in Europe or in the West. So the history of the world is the history of Europe or the West. The rest of the world is in the deep prehistorical darkness. But this is the whole story of the Eurocentrism. Yeah, but in 1949, several years later after the end of the World War II, the German philosopher Jan Kaspers, he proposed in his great book, The Origin and the Goal of History, that there was a very short period in history that he named the Actual Age. Yeah, several major ancient civilizations emerged simultaneously and, in his words, independently. Yeah, I think he's right. Because different ancient appeared in different places like China, Egypt, India, and Persia, and the Mediterranean areas, and other places. But I think Jasper is right when he put all these ancient civilizations in the history of the world. But when he said that these ancient civilizations emerged separately or independently, I think he is as wrong as the English poet Kipling, who is famous for his saying, "East is East, and West is West, and never the two shall meet." Yeah, I think that the Asian civilizations, they always contact each other. They travel very far, and they influence each other. There is no borderline, clear borderline or static borderline between the Asian civilizations. So I think there is two kind of the history of the of civilization. Asian civilization, one is the global one. The other is ideological one. Yeah. So I think different Asian civilization should not only emerge, simultaneously, but converged. Yeah, that's my point. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Cheng. Very pertinent points, and at a very important period of time when we are trying to revitalize the Chinese nation. And part of the pathway is to dig into our past and find renewed sources for imagination for our way forward. But let's come back to the definition of and boundary of classics and classical studies. Professor Papangelis, you come from Greece. We understand the common definition of classical study is ancient Greek and ancient Roman studies. So how do you look at what Professor Cheng said, for instance, that the Chinese classical traditions and Chinese classical studies also constitute a very important part of the world's classical heritage, if I may put it this way?
Yes, I suppose most scholars would admit that the classic is not just a Greek property or monopoly, if only they knew and they were aware of other classical traditions. Unfortunately, what I'm saying reflects my own history as a scholar. Unfortunately, until very recently, I spent my whole scholarly life and career moving from one venue in the West to another, and I have never had the chance or no one urged me to go beyond the Western conception of what is a classic. Of course, as a Greek, I am in a double bind because in Greece, when we talk about classical civilization, we, in most cases, mean Greek classical civilization and especially the civilization of the 5th century BC. Most Greeks don't go beyond that. The so-called Hellenistic period, which begins with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, is somehow remains for most Greeks an obscure period. Well, for the Greeks, classical civilization is tantamount, is equivalent to Greek classical civilization. This is something I have stressed, the point I have stressed in various articles I have written in Greek journals, trying to raise awareness of the broader conception of classics, one that includes, firstly, the Roman civilization. Now I feel that my project will branch out and I will write articles which will raise awareness and consciousness about other classical civilizations. I must confess that I came into contact with things concerning the Chinese civilization when the occasion of this trip arose.
Don't tell me this is your first trip to China.
I will tell you that this is Di Ichi Lai Zhongguo.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Well,
But I
sti-
do hope
should say,
that I will come back very soon.
please, please. This is our fault, Professor Cheng, no? I mean, we haven't invited important scholars like Professor Papangelis much earlier. Let's hope that this is definitely not your last
Well,
visit.
I do hope that we can share more experiences in the near future.
Great.
I stress the near future because, you know, time goes by and we're not as fit as we should be when time goes by.
I'm quite optimistic. I'm quite optimistic, yeah.
Be optimistic too.
Given the zest we're seeing
Yes.
in China, yeah, about
Anyway, I was saying that I came into contact with the notion, the concept of classic as far as China is concerned on the occasion of this trip. I tried to acquaint myself with the ways in which Chinese scholars have received the Western classical civilization. But in the course of trying to acquaint myself with that, I also learned some very interesting, fascinating things about how the Chinese scholars see through the Greek and Roman classical civilization, their own civilization,
we'll talk.
how this interpretation affects their public, political, and ideological life, which is quite different from what goes on in the West today.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating. Next, let me go to Professor Petrov, coming from Russia. How is classical studies in the traditional sense understood in your context? And what do you think of this idea from China to make people aware or understand that Chinese classical studies is a very important part of classical traditions around the world?
In Russia, classical tradition experienced its ups and downs. It started developing very quickly at the end of the 19th century, especially in the beginning of the 20th century. But historical turmoil put an abrupt end to this. Then, in the 60s, step by step, the classical studies developed. There was a rise of classical scholarship in the 90s. So it oscillates. Unfortunately, there is permanent some problems, economical, political, and everything. So, but we still exist. We're still working, and we came here at this great conference and looking at what you are doing, what great amount of effort you invest in classical studies, let me think that our future is not lost. I mean, and we may hope to work and benefit from classical studies. And of course, classical studies are not confined to the heritage of Greek and Roman heritage. In my country, we love classical Chinese poets. For example, when I was a student, when I was younger, we all loved the poetry of Li Bai, One Wei. We listened to Chinese classical flute music and string music, and I was very fond of it. And we read the translations of Tao Te Ching and everything, and Confucius, and so on. And of course, classical studies in China will bring Chinese culture stronger in every sense of the word. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a classical tradition in the Russian context as well? And maybe we get back to that later. You know, how is Russia trying to rediscover the treasures from its classical tradition? Let me move on to Professor Whitmarsh. From your perspective, classics or classical tradition, what has it meant traditionally? And what do you think of the rising awareness or the intention to say, hey, we here in this part of the world, we have also a brilliant classical heritage as well, and we want the world to know about that. What do you think of this?
Well, I think Professor Chan put it very well when he said that there's a distinction between a historical sense of classicism and an ideological one. And I would develop that in saying that, I mean, it's quite clear that there are some cultures that base themselves on a deep literate tradition. And as Professor Chan also said, the axial age cultures of China, India, and Greece are all cultures that have this deep sense of a rich connection to a past which is not necessarily a sacred past, but a literate past. So that sense of reflection upon the historical past through texts is important to classical cultures in their historical dimension. But there's also something that we do in the present when we are classicists. We give value to certain traditions. So it becomes a moral question to us what we choose to value in the world. And in an increasingly globalized, interconnected world, it becomes extremely important that we are equitable, that we are fair, and that we value all traditions equally and build those in. Now, you can't become an expert in all ancient traditions simultaneously, but in Britain, to come to that particular national context, in the 21st century, we have seen a large demographic shift, if you like, that there has been a lot of immigration amongst our student body. We have a great diversity of young people coming from all over the world, and clearly we cannot persist with the Western-centered view of things, suggesting that there is only one classical tradition. It becomes a real, as I say, urgent moral question to us to expand our sense of what the classical is.
Well, it's very encouraging to hear that there is this growing awareness to expand the horizon for scholars and for ordinary people alike. We'll get back to that in just a moment. Professor Inglese, I would like to hear your understanding. Of course, Italy has brilliant classical traditions. In China, people are very familiar with the Divine Comedy of Dante, for instance, which is one of your specialized field of study. What is your thoughts at this moment when we discuss the world range of classical studies?
Come richiesto dalla nostra gentile moderatrice, cercherò di fare degli esempi per rendere più chiaro il mio pensiero. Spesso mi è stato chiesto.
I will try to give some examples to make my point more clearly. I have been asked on various occasions whether the works of writers like Dante and Machiavelli can be considered modern. I reply that it is inaccurate to refer to a text as modern or define them as ancient classics.
Chiamare moderno un testo, un classico antico, non è corretto. È qualcosa che ci allontana da un rapporto autentico.
If we think this way, it distances us from these works. What is classical, and especially classical literature?
È un'opera che riesce a esprimere elementi essenziali della interiorità umana.
For example, it is a work that fully expresses the basic elements of the human condition in a particular historical form, a work that speaks to the human heart. These basic elements make the classics of all times universal.
Contenuti, questi elementi che ci rendono appunto universali, i classici di tutte le epoche. Un esempio.
As an example, a very familiar character in Dante's Divine Comedy is a lady named Francesca da Rimini from the late 13th century. This good lady lived in hell where she fell prey to violent winds that represented her inner emotions.
Questa gentile signora è stata collocata da Dante all'inferno, dove è preda di un turbine che rappresenta che cosa? Rappresenta il turbine dei suoi sentimenti.
The wind drove her to cheat on her husband. She fell in love with her brother-in-law. Dante wants to put the reader in the shoes of this relationship, an emotion that we can only understand through historical reconstruction.
Orbene, la passione d'amore che Dante riesce a generare nel suo testo e di cui ci fa certamente partecipi.
This reconstruction is not only done linguistically, but also culturally, to understand the feelings that took place in this historical situation of the time, when this medieval love conflicted with the Christian doctrine.
Della contingenza e della situazione in cui si generò, in cui si formò la poesia d'amore medievale a partire dalle corti.
Medieval love poems that originated in the courts of south-central France also became popular during this time period.
Forte contrasto che si stabilì tra questa dottrina d'amore e, diciamo, la morale di ispirazione cristiana.
Also, through ideological and moral condemnation, Dante helps us understand the passion that Francesca da Rimini felt.
Attraverso la condanna ideologica, la condanna morale del personaggio.
I think you're talking about the importance of putting classical works in their proper context so that you can properly understand their significance. So the modern significance of classical studies, that's the theme of our discussion today. And I think it is really why we're here. And I want to throw this question to all of our panelists, regardless of how you define the boundaries of classical study. Why should we be paying attention to this? And why maybe in some parts of the world, less and less attention is being given to classical studies. How does it help us as a man or a woman in the present day and age, Professor Cheng?
Like any other Asian civilization, China has a long history of classical studies. And later it was divided into two schools. The Han school. The Han school means pay much attention. Han, named after the dynasty Han. It is called Han school, stressing the contextual criticism. Textual,
Dynasty being
textual
about
criticism. And another school is the Song, Song school. Pay much attention to the explanation, interpretation of the old books. So that actually these two schools should have, complementary to each other. It is possible, but actually, in reality, in the Qing dynasty, the split, contradictory to each other. So, but both of these schools declined under the pressure of the Western civilization in the late Qing dynasty. But I don't think they were replaced by the Western civilization. That is a recreation, the so-called global local. Yeah. So I think the new civilization is based upon the West, the East, and even from the India Buddhism. Yeah, all these come together and made a new civilization. So I don't think there is a borderline between different civilizations. If we say that there is a very static, very clear borderline, that means we see others as the other. Yeah. But I think each other is very important. It's more important than the other. The other is just the lost part of ourselves, or the missing part of ourselves, or the other side, or the other self of ourselves, which has not yet been recognized by ourselves. So I think the modernization or the convergence of all these civilizations makes a greater contribution to all, respectively, all the Asian civilizations. Okay.
Okay, I'm not sure if the other panelists would agree with you, your interpretation of the West and East being, it's very interesting, the other being the unconscious or unrealized, the other half of oneself. But how does this understanding help us in the present day, in our way to cope with present day challenges? Professor Cheng, in one sentence, because that was my question. Why does it matter to know the other?
I just want to raise another phenomenon in psychology. Before we find the unconsciousness, we all think the reason is the only self, the very solid self of selves. But when the unconscious, it was found, then we say it is not antagonist to us. It is combined. A wholeness of the human being. Okay.
Very interesting. This is getting philosophical. I hope my audiences are not switching channels right now. But Professor Papangelis, what is your take? For instance, because we always talk about the East and the West, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. What are some of your reactions?
Every age, I think, asks itself how a classical civilization is relevant to me, everyone living in every age. There was a time, especially during the European Renaissance, the humanists in the 14th, 15th century thought that the ancient civilization is relevant and important because it makes you a better person. Contact with the great minds of antiquity makes you a better person. And a secondary, perhaps, good, which one could derive from studying the ancient texts, was the improvement of one's style, of one's writing style. Now,
because let me take advantage of this. You're from Greece. Give us an example of that, please.
Well, I will not, because Greece, unfortunately, did not have a Renaissance. When the Renaissance was in full swing, Greece was under the Ottoman rule. So I have no example in this particular case. But probably I will have other examples later. Now, a bit later, in the 19th century, as Professor Tim Whitmarsh knows much better than I do, in the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, you studied Greek and Latin, perhaps especially Greek, first because it was the mark of a gentleman, second because ancient Greek especially was a very difficult language, and learning it was a kind of mental gymnastics, a mental exercise. Well, these are periods and ideologies going by. Why should I study the classics today? Well, I have thought about this in many ways. One thing that comes to my mind now is a bit paradoxical. Some recent developments in the academia, in universities, are not about how classics can help me live my life today, but what I should avoid among the things that I see in classical texts. And classical texts are racist, are colonialist, are sexist, and all that. We know that we have this kind of reading of the texts, which in the framework of a philosophy of, woke or whatever you call it, political correctness, threatens the classics. I don't know what exactly it is that is so modern or so relevant in classical civilizations today, but I will say this. In my view, all classical civilizations are about the human subject as a free creator and as a moral agent. The threat today with technological developments and the so-called post-humanist era is that the human subject as a moral agent will be removed from the center of things. I think that what classical civilizations can offer today is the insistence on the value of the human subject, the autonomy of the human subject, the value of the human subject as a moral agent. I think classical civilizations are humanistic in that sense.
Okay, these are very loud, and I mean it figuratively. I think these will leave a mark on our minds, and we'll think about them. Let me move on to Professor Petrov. Yeah. Why do we do this? For the revitalize of our nation, for the rejuvenation of our people, for our character building, for the moral, for the human subject of ourselves? What do you think?
Yes, I think we're doing this to be humans, because it is really a threat when they say that we are living in a post-human world, the world which is more and more atomized, when individual has no roots, has no vertical or horizontal ties. This being has no past, no future. It can change constantly, change sex, name, bodily appearances, and everything. But it is miserable and unhappy inside. And especially in the times of turmoil, economic and political crises. And in such circumstances, the classical tradition reminds us that there exist eternal values and tradition which transcends boundary of national identity, which belong to the humankind. It could be Chinese classics, it could be Greek classics, it could be classics of the European Renaissance, and so on. But this provides us with some orienters. What is classic? Classics is something which is thought worth preserving. That is why it is something selected, and it is not only selected but translated. And how we translate something which belongs to the past? If we take some artifact from the past or the work of human genius, it remains dead until it is reinterpreted in our own terms, in our language, in our national language, in the language of our time, our epoch, our philosophy. For classics to exist is to be alive. That's why it should be constantly retold, rewritten. And here, all of us who are gathered here are translators in this broad sense. We receive something from deep in the past and trying to revitalize it.
What is the Russian aspect of it? Are there Russian classical studies in a sense, and how is that being interpreted or reinterpreted?
I'm doing ancient and medieval studies. So for us, for Chinese and Greek scholars, classical studies mean going to their native past. For Russians, it is exploring Greek and Roman heritage, which are mother culture, but it is different. And so there is always a tension between this reception and appropriation, to making it our own. And this is very interesting to have to reach this balance in the process.
Absolutely. We probably don't have time to go into the details. I have to step on the brakes here. Professor Whitmarsh, you were watching all of your previous speakers with absolutely neutral facial expressions. I cannot make up whether you approve or disapprove of their points so far. What are your opinions, your reactions?
Well, I think underlying your question is a contrast with the sciences. I mean, nobody ever says to a biologist or a chemist, what's the relevance of biology or chemistry to the modern day, because it's assumed to be self-evident. So really, the question is classical studies, is it something like a science? And in a way, it is not, because as people have been saying, there is this strong ethical dimension to it, how we relate to the past, how we choose to select which cultures we study. These are ethical questions that the scientists don't really have in quite that same way. But in another sense, I think it is really important that we hold on to the idea that what we do is a kind of science that is generating real, useful knowledge. And I will give you an example here. We have obviously recently come out of a pandemic. Now, classical studies will not help us understand the causes of that pandemic. It will not help us understand the solutions to that pandemic. But what it will help us to understand in a richer sense is historical approaches to pandemics and to plagues. In Greece, for example, there was the plague in Athens in the late 5th century AD, BC. There were two serious pandemics in the Roman Empire. What we know about these cultures was that plague was not just something medical that happened to the body. It caused a sense of panic amongst people. It caused a sense of the corruption of, a sense that there was a link between medical crisis and moral crisis, and linguistic crisis as well. Thucydides, for example, says words lost their meaning during the plague in Athens. So we can see in a way, a continuity of experience, that the pandemic is not simply a medical phenomenon, it is also an urgent human phenomenon, and understanding the rich depth of responses to these things can help us understand, as people have been saying, the continuity of the human subject, but also the differences, that there are, as we've heard, that we have to understand things in their historical context as well, and that a culture with less medical knowledge will have a different set of responses.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. Sometimes we were like, oh, this is how people in those eras feel about the things that we're feeling today, how they are addressing them. Probably we can find inspirations from there. I think one thing fortunate here in China is that there is actually a revitalization. I don't know if you have visited some of the museums, you know, some of the cultural sites, and on the national television, for instance, there is extreme emphasis on making popular programs that really help people relate to our ancient past, our modern past, let's say. And I want to come to Professor Papangelis and Professor Petrov, because I understand you have toured before this conference some of the cradles of Chinese civilization, either in Henan or Shandong or Sichuan provinces. What were your biggest takeaway? Would you like to share with us? And why do you think that left such a deep impression on you? One instance for each of you, please.
I had three options: Sichuan, Shandong, and Henan, and I chose Henan because it is the seat of all three ancient capitals of China, so loaded with history. And I was not let down. I admired something which is very special: the employment of technology for the presentation of the items in the museums I have visited. Apart from the exhibited items themselves, it was a very, very fascinating experience. I will communicate it to my Greek colleagues and those who are in charge of museums.
What kind of example? For instance, what was the one
Well, I mean,
experience you recall?
for example, I think it was in Luoyang. We saw videos of 5 or 6 minutes, which were bringing to life the history of the place, of the Shan dynasty, and all the things. The screens, the touch screens, where you can see an object from all sides and all that. I mean, I came away with a new experience of visiting a museum, and at the same time, a new experience of coming face to face with the past, with history.
Wow, I'm really happy to hear that. Coming from you, I'm really happy to hear that. Yeah, Professor Petrov.
I too was at the museums in Henan province, and we were at all three capitals, ancient capitals of China, and I very impressed by the scale of efforts and investments in museology. The expositions are tremendous, and I was very impressed by these digital technologies, and I think they are very important for young people who come there. For example, there was a small artifact, some creature and some smaller creatures sitting on it. And there is a huge screen on which it is immediately dissected and assembled again, and this creature jumps and walks, and in a second you understand what the ancient artist meant by this and what is the meaning of all this. I think these investments and efforts will benefit much and very soon, because it will attract people, and people will start interested in.
Okay. Professor Whitmarsh, Do you think in the modern day and age, with the use of new technology, there is hope that classical studies may find new agency or conduit to reach people, especially the younger generation? Very briefly, please.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
What are some of the best practices, for instance, from the UK?
Well, certainly, I mean, it's more of an international team, but
Okay.
there have been amazing strides recently with the development of new technologies to read the scrolls that were buried under the volcano eruption in Mount Vesuvius. So the technology involves using what we call an MRI scan, which is used normally for scanning the human body, but rather than breaking open these charred rolls, the MRI scan can look at all of the individual layers, and what it sees, of course, is a mess of smudged ink. And then artificial intelligence can then be used to put all that data together and to compose texts. So we are having new texts, new ancient Greek texts emerging before our eyes as a result of these really cutting-edge technologies. And it's a marvel to behold. It's a marvel not just for classicists, but for scientists as well, because they're discovering, of course, their technology is becoming richer, stronger, sharper as a result of the practical applications.
Absolutely. It's international collaboration.
It is, yes.
International cooperation is so important. I'm going to wrap up here by giving each and every one of you an opportunity to leave us with one sentence. What would you like to say to the audience, to our audience members who stayed with us till now? Bye.
Okay, I pick up the word global. Every situation is global in a sense it shares some common ground with other civilizations, and it is local because it can contribute many specialties to the common ground. Okay.
Gloco. Okay, Professor Papangelis.
Well, I am a bit worried that the classical civilization and the classical past is gradually slipping away from the mind of Europe. China has a brilliant classical civilization. Let the younger generation take care not to forget about it.
Professor Petrov.
I'd like to say to the Chinese audience that I'm very impressed by the great efforts you pay to the keeping classics alive. Thank you very much for receiving us at this great conference. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Professor Whitmarsh.
Well, I'd like to echo those thanks. I mean, clearly it's been a wonderful occasion and a great honour to be here. But my one thing that I would like to communicate to people, really, is that we face a world of unprecedented complexity, militarily, economically, medically, and so forth. In these situations, we only have one resource to help guide our decision making, and that is the past. We need to value and cherish that past and to know it in as great and as rich detail as possible.
Thank you. Remember the past. Professor Inglese.
Soprattutto mi sembra molto importante che si avviino agli studi classici.
It's very important for young people to enter classical studies at an early age. From my experience, new technologies are very useful and help a lot in presenting literature.
Le nuove tecnologie sono molto utili e aiutano molto a presentare.
Proficiency in Latin and Greek also has to be cultivated in high school.
Del greco va formata abbastanza seriamente al liceo.
Thank you. Congratulations on the success of this conference.
L'organizzazione di questa conferenza.
Thank you. Let us be the master of new technology to help preserve the past. Maybe that's the message. And I want to wrap up with this classical quote, which I opened this discussion with. To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. And with that, I want to thank all my distinguished panelists for this very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for sharing with us your insights. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.